China followed a model that was crafted by Japan and the Four Small Dragons. It had and really up until very, very recently has been having astonishing growth. I would argue, and I think the piece we read, the stuff we read last week would confirm that has been due largely to popular entrepreneurship, from the smallest, plastic pressing shop that was built along the walls of the railroad ministry in Guangzhou to Huawei and everything in between. Okay? And yet at the same time, we saw an argument that China's economy will continue to lag behind the United States because essentially of two reasons: mistaken policies and democratic deficit. We talked about the breakdown in the relationship, at least in economic terms, and the idea that it was in part due to the sense on the United States side that there had been a broken bargain on the Chinese side, that foreign pressure and U.S. pressure and international organization pressure, I'm thinking particularly the World Trade Organization, posed a threat to China's sovereign control, or at least the party's sovereign control. And I just want to note a couple of things that we talked about and should be still thinking about. Emily Jen raised the James Mann comment that there are some doubts as to whether China will follow South Korea and Taiwan's democracy. And I never quarrel with James Mann. I'm far too sensible to do that. But I would caution against his argument that either South Korea or Taiwan moved to democracy primarily or exclusively due to U.S. pressure. I think if you look at the case of Taiwan, it was in fact a reaction against the United States pullback that led Taiwan to democracy. And, President Jiang Jingguo moved to democracy because of his own sense that that was the way to deal with his particular circumstances. And if China moves to a less authoritarian system, it will do that for the same reasons, because of its own particular circumstance. Oscar raised at the end of class the Kearney study, which I have put on Blackboard, about the recent move to decoupling or diversifying or reshoring U.S. productive enterprises, which I think is an extremely interesting one. And I think one of the points that it makes indirectly is that this is something that is driven largely by economic requirements. In some cases, those economic requirements are reinforced either by policies on either side or by decisions on either side, the trade war, the tariff war, that led companies to make those choices. But it is not an either or. It is not working with having a productive relationship, a supply chain with China or not. It's a wide range of options made for business reasons, and oftentimes productive capacity that left China did not return to the United States, but moved to other locations. So just a fascinating and complex issue. And the role of racism. I put up today, I think, on Blackboard, the open letter on anti-Asian racism. It's something we need to be aware is there. We need to be aware it may be affecting people's choices, and not in ways that are either to our credit or that benefit us in practical terms. So that's essentially where I see issues coming out of last week. Anything else coming out of last week that people would like to raise? Let me see. I need to bring up the participants so I can see people when they're raising their hand. And okay, I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to move on. Okay, this is week 13. My son believes that 13 is a lucky number since he proposed to his wife and got married, both on Friday the 13th. So I'm going to, in that vein, say that Monday the 13th can be equally lucky. We're going to talk about two sets of issues in today's class. We're going to talk about Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. You had some readings on those, and I want to just offer some thoughts about the U.S. role there. And then a strategic wrap-up following that. So here's essentially the way I see this proceeding. We're going to talk about human rights in America's DNA. We're going to talk about how that applies in the cases of those three areas, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. And I would argue that the United States cannot and should not attempt to play a direct role. Okay? And then I'm going to turn to the strategic issues, beginning with the inputs that you all provided about Chinese and U.S. dissatisfactions and how to respond to them, and how can either side meet the other's concerns. Then want to turn and ask, where are the biggest obstacles? And having done that, I will then attempt a wrap-up, turning largely to David Michael Lampton and to Robert Blackwell. So with that, the discussion question that we posed for this week, and I apologize that it was late in the week, returned to an issue that we've talked about on several occasions, and that is strategic distrust. And the question that I'm asking here is, what actions can either China or the United States take that might reduce strategic distrust? And who has the lead on that? Who's going first?
I can start off with that.
Okay.
So I had to kind of look up and more clearly define what strategic distrust means, and I found in a Brookings lecture that someone defined it as the mutual distrust of long-term intentions, which I thought was helpful to kind of frame the conversation. And so I think for the U.S., Lampton talks about how the U.S. tends to have too many interests, which we consider fundamental. And I think I agree with him and believe that we need to prioritize and decide which are most important, because otherwise China's going to have trouble trusting that when we say something is oh yes, Travis, I'll post a link to that. But otherwise China's going to have trouble trusting that when we say something is a fundamental interest, that we aren't just listing off too many. And he also talks about not overreacting when China does something that is not critical to our fundamental interests. So, for example, our overreaction arguably to the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and also an overreaction to academic espionage by cutting off kind of educational collaborations, which are important for continued trust in the relationship.
Okay, good. Okay.
And if I can add one more thing from China's perspective, playing by the WTO rules and other major international kind of bodies rules, I think would go a really long way in reducing the strategic distrust between the United States and China.
Good. Thank you. Krish.
Hello. So kind of building off some of the points that Jenna just made in regards to specific actions that I think fuel at least China's sense of strategic distrust against the United States, for example, and kind of fitting in our topic for this week. For example, with Tibet, one of the Tibetan independence movements were kind of taking place. China was essentially pretty worried about internal mingling by the United States and, for example, supporting of Tibetan rebel groups and separatists. And I think that same kind of fear today has kind of been applied towards Xinjiang, so essentially towards internal security. And external meddling. And I think for the United States, I think it's just a simple lack of overt goals that fuel strategic distrust against China. I think people just generally don't know what the obvious goals of China are regarding South China Sea or regarding any of the other strategic interests that they may have. So I think it's a lack of transparency and communication, essentially.
Okay, so you're saying U.S. lack of clarity about China's overall goals.
Yes.
Okay. And is anyone else up to discuss today? If not, I invite any other comments on the issue of strategic distrust. What actions could we've had some suggestions about what fuels it, what can reduce it? What are the essential first steps in that direction? Anybody? Anyone want to take a pitch at this?
If I can just add a bit of a feeler. So I've been doing a lot of research for the reciprocity paper, for example, and a couple of stuff that I read is that initially US and China used to have a lot of military to military exchanges and meetings, which at some point, I think post the Hainan Island incident completely stopped. I think maybe that could be a potential opportunity to explore, and maybe we can get a better idea of how China's military and its goals are being formulated and evolving over time. Maybe that could be a place to start.
Okay, Ashley.
Yeah, I think strategic distrust can also explain how although we see how economic cooperations would be mutually beneficial for both parties, however, due to strategic distrust, both sides decided to marginalize these kind of mutual benefits, mainly because they don't, they kind of shift from achieving a relative advantage or like a positive sum game to shifting towards a absolute advantage kind of logic and trying to win this zero sum game in the political affairs. And in particular, I think I've this is like a Chinese diplomatic saying that the economic affairs are like an important like a caution for U.S.-China relations. And you don't necessarily, like when economic relations are good, you don't necessarily have good U.S.-China relations. But if economic relations are bad, you are having some problems with U.S.-China relations in general. So I think that kind of result from the strategic distrust. And like, I think a lot of the strategic distrust results from the belief of a zero-sum game. It doesn't matter like whether it is true, but if both sides believes that you have to have incompatible interests, then you would naturally marginalize a lot of compatible interests in your policy.
Okay. Good, thank you. Joe, did you have something?
Yes, sir. So just building off of what Ashley said with the economics, so another area that we can start building trust in right now, strategic distrust is kind of on we discussed this in other classes of what is the virtual periphery. So another area is in the space domain. So much like we did with the Russians during the Cold War, where there was a lot of distrust, one area that we could mitigate that distrust was through cooperation through our civilian space programs, area that we can work to build mutual interest and build on that trust.
Okay, that's a very interesting idea. Thank you. Let's see. Andy, are you up next? I think you are.
Yes, I did have my view on this. I think everything that my colleagues have mentioned so far has been very good. I just want to add one side to it. It's that I think part of the strategic distrust towards China comes from the fact that I think China is facing many domestic problems, but it's letting them spill over into foreign relations in an inappropriate and perhaps too abrasive way. One example is with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think last week we saw a couple of analyses that said it really was a way to deal with excess overcapacity and to maintain employment after the stimulus for the global financial crisis. But now it's becoming a way treated as a conspiracy to take over poor countries. And of course, the second aspect is the way that domestic issues over Tibet, Xinjiang especially, these domestic issues start to invite the concerns of human rights supporters. And then China, I think, hasn't dealt with this in the most fruitful way. It tends to just say these are strictly domestic matters, hands off. But the fact is that China has signed on to the Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. So it does have a commitment to human rights, and it does have a role in upholding them. It's not strictly domestic affairs. And so I'd say China needs to advance a more subtle diplomacy, whether for the Belt and Road, whether over Tibet and Xinjiang, whether over its own national mission of rejuvenation. It just needs to be more subtle.
Yeah, I wish oops, wait a minute. I wish I believed that either of us were more capable of subtle diplomacy at the moment. But anyway, David.
Yeah, hi. I actually, when we did the online discussion, I threw this in there. What you see a lot from Chinese leaders is a description of the current international system that's dominated by the U.S. as unfair and unreasonable. And so unfair because it doesn't adequately recognize China's perception of itself as a rising power. And I think there's a lot of sentiment on the side of China that they feel like they need to have more of a say in the international community. And then unreasonable, I think, is like an umbrella term for starting to lose confidence in U.S. competence. And Wang Zhishi, and sorry, I apologize for the pronunciations, and Ken Lieberthal wrote about this in their Brookings piece about strategic distress. I think it was back 2012 timeframe or something like that. But anyway, I think one of the key piece there is a belief that the United States is essentially acting as if they're in a different era than they are, and that they're failing to recognize the current reality of things, which is that their model is starting to come into question, and that China's rise has not been appropriately recognized. So I think if you take that argument as valid, then I think that there does need to be kind of a resetting of what that means for the two countries in a really, really grand strategic way. And you'll see my argument, sir, in my reciprocity paper of what I think needs to happen. But I do think that there needs to be a much more fundamental outlining of relationships, similar to what we saw in the three communiques. And I don't know if that's happened to acknowledge these changes.
Okay, those are an excellent set of ideas, and we're going to come back to them. Xiaohong?
Yes. Could you hear me?
Yes, we certainly can.
Okay, thank you. I have a question or some comments. We know ideology has always been an important factor in U.S.-China relations. I think maybe the U.S. needs to reflect on one question, that is a democratic China. Will a democratic China necessarily or even automatically make it more friendly and less threatening to the U.S.? This is a question I think maybe the U.S. side needs to, again, consider. And for reducing strategic distrust between the two countries, I think maybe both sides needs to intentionally downplay maybe the role of the ideology in the relationship, because the CCP has always been afraid and also vigilant of the U.S. trying to overthrow its role in China. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Jeremy.
I just have some thought about how the China-US can mitigate the strategic distrust between each other.
Sure.
So when I think about the US claim on China's violation of human rights in Xinjiang, Tibet, I just feel like such kind of claim will not mitigate the strategy is because what CCP did in Xinjiang and Tibet is for stabilize the social, is for the social stabilities instead of any other reasons. So if the U.S. kind of hard tone on China for violation of human rights, those will only make the situation worse. But I think U.S.-China can find some other areas to cooperate, try to mitigate the strategic distrust from the very beginning. For example, like climate change. U.S. can help probably introduce some new technology of how to make the core, efficiently, more efficiently and less environmental harmfully. I think that could be a very good start for the U.S. and China to start to working on something they all agree for the benefits of all countries. And the reason why I point this out because I think solving the climate change is also beneficial for China for the social stabilities. And if we think about the topics that have sort kind of relation to this specific example, I think U.S.-China can start a very beneficial role of winning the trust from each other.
Okay, excellent. We've got two more, and then we're going to move on. Benjamin.
Hi, Professor. I'll just be brief. I think one of the things that would probably help in terms of lowering strategic distrust is a more careful review of how both countries talk about the other. I think oftentimes what happens is it bleeds into kind of the social psyche of how the population views the other country, and therefore can end up constraining what leaders think is a possible thing that they can do. And so really being careful to try and foster a view that China is not necessarily a combatant or a major competitor, and that there is collaboration that is possible on the U.S. side, and vice versa for China, I think will go a long way towards opening up the ability for them to work together without such negative reactions.
Okay, excellent. And Jesse, you get the last word on this subject.
Unmuted. Okay.
There you go.
Well, with the North Korean issue, China is worried that the U.S. may want to have troops right up against the Chinese border, and the U.S. is concerned that Chinese boots on the ground on the Korean Peninsula, which South Korea definitely doesn't want. I think, especially in light of the news or the lack of news of Kim Jong-un, there may be some opportunity for more dialogue or some cooperation on trying to come to some sort of a agreement on long-term security in that region.
Yes. The North Korean angle is a fascinating one, and I have no idea what to make of it. I had the circumstance of being in our embassy in Seoul one Saturday morning when we were suddenly alerted that North Korean radio was playing what appeared to be funeral music, and maybe Kim Il-sung had died. Well, yes, they were playing funeral music, and no, Kim Il-sung had not died. So, we may be back there again, but it's interesting that South Korea has no more interest in our having boots in North Korea than do the Chinese. And my reaction to that is, God bless both of them. I don't see why we want our boots there. We can do a lot of helpful things and a lot of things that will make a real difference without going that way. So, fascinating set of issues. And I take the point that I think all of you are making is among the difficult issues between our two countries, the issue of distrust is probably the hardest and probably the one that is going to take the longest to resolve. But there are lots of small incremental steps that we can take that will have beneficial impacts in other dimensions and reduce distrust in the long run as well. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the issue of human rights. And I'm going to start with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay? I'm going to talk about the overlap of rights and strategy. And this is the image is one of 4 that Norman Rockwell did at the request of the U.S. government during World War II to capture the image of FDR's 4 freedoms. And it is simply to make the point that however you want to describe it, the idea of human rights is, and the belief in religious rights, minority rights, democracy, representative elections, and so forth, are issues that the United States cares deeply about at home and overseas. It's part of the American DNA. It's part of what we are. You know, we cast our founding story as pilgrims seeking religious liberty. Of course, the other side of the story was there were planters seeking wealth, enslaving the first Native Americans, and then imported Africans. But we focused on religious liberty in the Pilgrims. Even in the slaveholding South, the first story school children learned was Thomas Jefferson writing that all men are created equal. That's sort of what leads in the long way round to Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jimmy Carter, all of whom made human rights central pillars in their approach to international relations. Now, Americans, like everybody else, we have our elements of being hypocritical. Yes. But nonetheless, this is deeply felt. And I think it has led to constructive actions by the United States and by Americans outside of the government. A lot of what we call foreign relations is ordinary, or not ordinary, sometimes extraordinary, individuals not associated with the government doing important things overseas. In China, that was building schools, universities, hospitals, and yes, missionary churches in ways that were beneficial to China in the 19th and 20th centuries, that really set some of the fundamental capabilities for China to begin its Republican evolution and modernization. Okay? And that brings me to the 3 areas that I want to talk about, of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. These areas have 2 very different aspects, both from China's point of view and from ours, but particularly from the United States point of view. The first is strategic and economic. All 3 of these areas have important consequences for strategic balance in the region. Professor Freeman touched a little bit on this, and the economic prosperity of China and of the region. And they also have important effect on perceptions of and the reality of human rights. American advocacy for Tibet, let's just start there, is longstanding. Every American president, and I did a quick check and I could find it going back to George H.W. Bush, I wouldn't be surprised if it goes before that, has met the Dalai Lama. Numerous congressmen and senators, from Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi to Tom Lantos, have made Tibet central in their expressions of concern about human rights in China. That same concern was present about Xinjiang, but really erupted when news reports began to detail Beijing's efforts to overwhelm the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in a tide of ethnic Han migrants, to suppress their Muslim faith and practices, and finally to begin a penal re-education campaign on a massive scale. There are a lot of reasons for that. Social stability may be part of that, but I think there are other issues going on as well. And what we're not touching on here, but we could go into, is the importance of rights for Chinese, Han Chinese, to practice their chosen religion. And that has also been a central concern. And this is where I take a moment to plug a book. If you have not read this book, The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao, it's written by Ian Johnson. One, it's just a good read. It's thoughtful, it's thorough, it's perceptive, and it's well written. In another time, I would recommend this as airplane reading, but we're not taking those long flights right now. So, if you have some quiet time while you're at home, this is a great book to read. But he talks about how ordinary Chinese have sought to practice Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucian beliefs, as well as Christian beliefs. It's interesting that book was largely written before the current crackdown under Xi Jinping on religion, and some of the people that he talked to and talks about have suffered the effect of Xi Jinping's campaign. Want to talk briefly about Hong Kong, central to U.S. interests in China. First, because during the Cold War, before 1971-72, it was our nearest window on China. We had no representation in Beijing, and we used our consulate general in China to collect information about China, try to understand what was going on. It was also a financial center and entrepot port for U.S. businesses, particularly after reform and opening. Most recently, it has come to the fore because of U.S. concerns that Hong Kong is not being accorded the economic, social, and political rights it was promised under the Basic Law after its 1997 reversion to China. Now, does China have a historic claim and a valid sovereign claim to Hong Kong like Macau? Yes, given. I don't think that's a question. What is in question is whether China has honored the commitments it has made, and that I would argue it made in its own self-interest. Now, all of these issues, whether it's Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, have become central and high decibel elements in U.S. policy toward China. It has been part of that popular rhetoric that we were just talking about. And all of this would be grist for a very interesting course on China's political and social and ideological evolution over the past century and going forward. However, I would argue we should divide the U.S. approach, the American approach to all of these issues into two parts. One, Americans, like Chinese, perceive ourselves to be an exceptional people, entitled to speak our minds individually and collectively on all matters domestic and global. For Americans, the Enlightenment tradition of individual liberty, conceiving the state as the servant of the people, is central to American consciousness, and we should express that. We should make clear to our international counterparts that we will express these opinions and concerns, and we will argue they are in the self-interest of anyone seeking a stable political or social environment. At the same time, Americans need to understand, the US government needs to understand and make clear that we understand that social change cannot be forced from the outside. Change will come from within the society and the political structure, whether it is to our liking or not. We cannot, and we are not, either the white knight or the black hand. And anyone who thinks we are the black hand, please give me some information, because there hasn't been any. Okay, that's essentially what I wanted to say on this set of issues. Any comments or questions at this point? If there are, raise your hand. Okay. I don't see any comments in this, so I'm going to move to the second part of our class that I think will occupy most of our time and attention. I hope over the next hour or so to wrap up the semester by trying to integrate the various aspects of what we've studied concerning the relations of the United States and China. To help do that, I posed a hypothetical scenario last week. I asked you to imagine that President Trump and President Xi had spoken by phone and expressed their shared concern about the strains that recent trade tensions, COVID-19 pandemic, and perhaps other issues have placed on the bilateral relationship. To deal with this, they agreed to establish a bilateral task force to evaluate these concerns and consider how to address them. And I asked you to provide input to that task force on these 4 questions. What are the sources of Chinese dissatisfaction with the United States, U.S. dissatisfaction with China? What should China do to remedy U.S. dissatisfaction? And what should the U.S. do to remedy China's dissatisfaction? And I asked you to provide your inputs onto the discussion board, and I want to thank all of you who did that. I will make an opening comment, which is I thought your comments were excellent. And there were times when I was reading them that I felt I should waive the final exam for anyone who contributed to the discussion board. I've decided not to do that. So what I'd like to do is review your inputs, and going to look at each of you, the inputs to each of these questions. I've taken the names off. So I believe I've gotten the substance of the inputs correct. If you disagree with the input or you disagree with my summary of your brilliant insights, just give me a shout. But I want to ask, did we miss anything? Okay. And then I'm going to ask the painful question in each category of how do we prioritize? What's number one? What's number two? Because we're not going to get it all. Okay. And we're going to have to make trade-offs, regardless of who we're representing or what we hope to accomplish. So let's talk about what's essential from either point of view. Okay. After we do that, I'm going to back up and sort of look at what the obstacles to making progress might be, and what some of the issues that we would have to address on the process side. And some of you have had some experience in this. And some of you have either on the military side or the civilian side been engaged in tough negotiations. And so I'm going to ask you to chime in with your thoughts as to what might make this more workable, what might make it less. Okay? So with that, and again, anybody who has something you want to chime in with, just raise the blue hand and I will come to you. So here are the elements that I saw in terms of China's dissatisfaction. Unhappy with U.S. mishandling of the COVID-19 epidemic. And believe me, they're nowhere near as unhappy as I am. But anyway, the thought that China is a reluctant number two. In other words, that China is reluctant to get too involved in acting on the world stage. Perhaps, although the author didn't say this, this is a continuation of Deng Xiaoping's advice to lie low and bide its time. The U.S. is engaged in unnecessary and vindictive trade war that's shown contempt for China's development, demeaned its role in the IMF and the AIIB. The U.S. has dominated the international system unfairly, and this unreasonably allows for U.S. intervention. As leader of the world order, the U.S. threatens the Communist Party and China's status and sovereignty. We are seeking political unrest, for example, in Hong Kong, separatism in Taiwan. And we have a needlessly harsh narrative of China as an enemy. Okay? We're meddling in human rights, reducing complex Chinese security improvements into a simplistic concept of a threat against the U.S. And the way we've mismanaged the bilateral relationship leaves the two sides in a tit-for-tat squabble. It's quite a menu of concerns. Does anyone want to comment on any of those, reframe them, or add an additional one? Oscar.
I just wanted to add one, sir, and actually Jenna just said something in the group chat that's in my mind.
Okay.
China, in some of the editorials I've read in Global Times and other sources, they're really unsatisfied with the U.S. pushing its solutions as the standard. And one of them is counterterrorism, for instance, and just showing, well, look, look what you've done. Look at regime change throughout the Middle East and the disaster that's been. And then who are you to now come and criticize the way that we handle the People's War on Terrorism in Western China, which doesn't interfere with any other country or cause suffering to any other country. So unless the point was indirectly made and I missed it, I thought that what Jenna brought up in the chat really pointed to that argument that I'm seeing more and more in some of the Chinese op-eds.
Yeah. Yes. Good addition. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Oscar. Well put. Okay. David, did you have something?
Yeah, to pile on to both what Jenna chatted about it and Oscar too, I think the Chinese perception of sovereignty is really important, and that it be inviolable. So like the 5 principles between China and India, which I won't get into. But anyway, that's probably an example of how they think international relations should run, and that's not what the United States has done in terms of feeling like it could speak into internal policies. One of the things that gets brought up by Chinese critics of U.S. is the color revolutions and the U.S. promotion of democracy that is perceived as being power politics. I think it's pretty widely, kind of felt within China, at least from what I've read, that can be perceived as a form of power politics and not necessarily something that's sincere. And so I think that's actually, at the end of the Libertal Jussieu piece, a few years ago, they basically get to that conclusion, which is that we're not going to be able to resolve this difference. And so we'll have to figure that one out. And I feel like that was in the 1972 communique as well.
Yeah, that's a miserably tough one. Yes. Okay. Joe?
Yes, sir. Just going back up to the bullet about being unfair and unreasonable, it's not just about U.S. intervention, but the West at writ large doing a China containment strategy. So, not only does China think that the system's unfairly keeping China down, but the unreasonably part is more associated with the fact that China views the current system as causing the problems, not just not fixing them. So we're not fixing the problems, we're making them worse, and keeping China and its system from being a positive solution is an important piece. So it's not just U.S. intervention, it's containment writ large.
Good. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. David, you've spoken. Joe, you've spoken. Jenna.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick addition and also ask a follow-up question. So just adding on to something I put in the group chat was I thought that McMaster's phrasing of the issue as strategic narcissism, that the U.S. has kind of this pride and this hubris, thinking that they can just intervene and force change kind of wherever they want around the world. And I think that factors into perhaps their reticence about continued U.S. leadership in the same way on the global stage. And the other thing, I wanted to ask a question about the second point for whoever commented on Blackboard, saying that China was a reluctant number 2 actor, reluctant to act on the world stage. I'd be really curious to hear more about what that means.
Okay. I apologize. Oops, what did I do? There we go. Okay. Both good comments. Anybody else? Anybody want to comment on China as a reluctant number 2?
Sure, I can just clarify. In the Debating China book, there's a really good section about how China has been called by the U.S., by prominent people in the U.S., the last administration, as a selective stakeholder. And I think it's kind of it's a really great debate, and it's really interesting. Because it's a safe place for them to be, to kind of choose for China to be. And in context of COVID, there's so much opacity over what they're really thinking, what their real reaction has been, and obviously this administration doesn't create any clarity. But it's very difficult to understand what their real response is and what their real intent is in the response. And I would say, that's kind of a exemplary of being that reluctant number two.
Good. And, I was struck as reading one of the articles that someone flagged from Foreign Affairs magazine. I often wonder if the end of the Cold War and that what we call the unipolar moment was not a curse that was visited on the United States, so that we would have to suffer the strategic confusion that we have carried from that moment. And the idea, I remember, yes, I read The End of History. This idea that, we have finally come to the place where everyone always wanted to be, and it's the United States. So, fascinating set of issues. Ashley, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I have about 2 comments. And first, I just adding on Jenna's idea, I think strategic narcissism is a very interesting concept. I have definitely read something related saying that the US has more of a missionary type of diplomacy, which they want to forge changes outside of the US in the world, in the rest of the world, while in comparison China is more China's more reluctant to interference, although you see how China is kind of twisting its position on that point. And I would also add on that concept that China is cares more about prestige and face in general. They don't want to be challenged on a lot of things because it is losing face for China's public image. My second comment is on the stakeholder, the reluctant number 2 thing. I'm not the one who add on that comments, but I think there would be an observation about how during whose time, Hu Jintao's time, not Hu Jintao's time, China's rhetoric was we are growing, we're rising kind of, but we are still a developing country. We have our own problems, a lot of poverty problems, developing problems. However, you see how this is changing now with Xi Jinping's presidency. You see how they're planning to eliminate poverty actually by the end of this year, which you see that. You also see how they are marginalizing the rhetoric of how China has been a developing country, although they still manipulate this idea when it comes to human rights, because economic rights are part of the whole human rights discourse of China. But in general, you see how China is kind of shifting away from this idea that we used to be poor and we're having our own problems, and kind of implying that we're ready to share or we're ready to show them more responsibility in the international world. And coronavirus definitely not provided opportunity, but it kind of gave a chance for China to provide some certain public goods for other countries. So that kind of it sounds very weird, open opportunity,
it is weird. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to throw out a random observation, and one of you will probably come back and counter it in a very perceptive way. But oftentimes I think that the United States and China both have this idea that we are extraordinary. And I take your point, Ashley, that the U.S. has this missionary sense of going out and forging changes in the international environment. I would argue that China's response is comparable, but they do it in a very different way, which is instead of going out, they look to be the center and draw everything in. So it all centers around them. So the end result is, in an interesting way, parallel, but the intellectual mechanism is quite different. I'm not certain that's true, but it's a thought that occurred to me, and I'm throwing it out in case someone has something useful to counter with. Jesse, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a quick observation. I think some in the Communist Party, they may feel that there are some in the US government that doesn't view the Communist Party as being the legitimate ruler of China. You hear a lot of the rhetoric trying to split the Chinese state from the party. They say our beef is with the Communist Party clique and not with the Chinese people. So there may be some dissatisfaction from the Chinese side where they feel that even 70 plus years after and 40 plus years after establishing the diplomatic relations, maybe there are still some groups that don't view them as the legitimate ruling.
Yeah. There was an interesting article I saw over the weekend on that topic, pointing out that if you don't think that the Communist Party is legitimate, you need to cope with the fact that it has 90 million members. And if you're going to split the party from the people, do you split what part of the party from what group of the people? And I'm not saying there's definitely an answer to that, but okay. Oscar, you raised your hand. Is it still raised?
Oh, sir, the point I was going to make is just made, but I was going to type in the group chat, Robert Daly, that the China Studies Department promoted a couple of weeks ago, his webinar, which Sites just put up on the YouTube channel.
Yes, which is excellent.
Yes, it was really good. And he addressed this point very, very well about, trying to draw perhaps an exaggerated dichotomy between the Communist Party and the Chinese people, how that can backfire very significantly in the way that it's received in China.
Yes. Yeah, I thought that was a very good exchange overall. And those of you who have not, did not see it, it's up on the SAIS website. Is that it, Oscar?
It's on SAIS Events, the YouTube channel. I'm not sure if it's on the school website, but
okay.
It's Robert Daly, D-A-L-Y.
Okay, great. Again, very definitely worth. Okay, I'm going to ask an inconvenient question, which is, there are a lot of good ideas up here. Absolutely. But, when you go in with a laundry list of complaints, and I don't mean that disparagingly, and you want another side to address them, if you come in with this list, you're stuck. You got to come in with a list that has at most 3 of these as top issues. This is what I really need you to deal with. No, it's not important that you sort the socks every morning. It's really important that you, okay. So somebody help me out. If China's going to come in with 1 or 2, these are absolutely key. You got to resolve these or nothing else matters. Somebody give me one. What would you put at the top of China's list?
U.S. as the leader of the global order threatens the CCP's and China's status of sovereignty.
Okay, help me find that down the list, Trevor.
You're on it, right? Or one up.
Okay, this one.
So the reason I would say that argument sort of encompasses a lot of the other arguments that people were making. So you're achieving many things by picking like one more broad statement, I guess.
Okay.
So, under that, you can throw in any argument. I would argue you could throw in any discussion about like stakeholders, how they treat their people in the U.S. involving themselves in that, expansion, stuff like that. So I went with the one that I thought was a more encompassing than very selective, I guess.
Okay. That's a good argument. I like that. I saw somebody else start to chime in, and then I don't see a hand up. So, okay. How do people feel about that? Jesse and then Andy. Jesse. And then Nate. Okay. Jesse.
So another way that the U.S. is threatening China's sovereignty is selling arms to Taiwan, which is the renegade province, and it's a clear violation of international law from the Chinese perspective. So it goes back to sovereignty, but it's U.S. support for Taiwan.
Okay, good. Andy.
I want to start from a basic principle. I think that confrontation in diplomacy is not a bad thing most of the time. Confrontation is how you find where you haven't been able to establish a common ground just yet, and to work towards establishing a common ground.
Okay.
The problem is where claims are made that are exclusive. And I think I want to back Travis's choice, where the U.S. says it's the leader of a global order. But I also want to add that it's important for maybe the U.S. or the West more broadly not to pursue a containment strategy. These two ways of talking about foreign relations are strictly exclusive of China, and I don't think there's any way to build a common ground from there. But issues such as human rights, such as trade relations, such as the pandemic, I think all of these issues are ways to move forward on. They're challenges.
Okay. That's an interesting way to look at it. Thank you. Nate.
I'd like to build on that too, and possibly add a little bit different of a pivot to that. I had an occasion to speak in a panel discussion a few months ago with respect to space and establishing new frontiers and behaviors in space. And a colleague of mine on the panel, Dean Chang from the Heritage Foundation, pointed out that in any kind of establishment of international order in the international regime, if you move out on establishing those kinds of norms, and China does not have a seat at the table from the inception, then the legitimacy of that of those established rules become questionable from the PRC perspective, and so I don't know if that's different than saying U.S. as a leader of the global order, or participation from the CCP. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do. And I think, I take your point in space. The place I come that tends to get me fuming was the argument over Chinese voting rights in the IMF. And I would argue there is a level at which the United States was really the founder of the AIIB, because I think we provoked reactions in China, or let's put it this way, we made more intense some Chinese reactions that led to its feeling that, if you won't let me play in your sandbox, I'll go build my own. Not the sole answer to the problem. Okay. This is what I'm hearing as our central issue is, does someone want to offer me a counter that it should be another direction? Just dealing with this all by itself is a massive undertaking, but I think an important one. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to say we sort of dealt with this issue for the moment. Let's look at U.S. dissatisfaction. And again, I've tried to capture some of the thoughts that you threw in there. I don't think I snuck my own ideas in there. At least I tried not to. First is that China has not been a responsible stakeholder. I like the idea of China being a selective stakeholder, something that I hope someone will develop a little bit more. China used the COVID-19 crisis to expand its soft power and for an opportunistic global influence grab. I think that's a quotation. China's opaque decision-making process, lack of transparency, COVID-19 example. Disappointed hope that China has not become more democratic. Discomfort at the U.S. It's eroding primacy as the Chinese sphere of influence is expanding. China's unfair activities in trade and non-trade arenas. Economic concerns more generally, betrayal of WTO commitments, IPR theft, monopolization of the export of rare earths, concentration of critical supply chain elements, unfair use of developing nation designation, and China's growing influence in South and Southwest Asia, which really means Iran and the Middle East. Quite a list there. What other elements would people add? What's missing? What needs to be rephrased? Oscar.
So one thing that's really come to light just in the past couple of days is just catastrophic low empathy diplomacy all over the world. So it's not just a U.S. complaint. I mean, Western Europe, Australia, a lot of African countries. There's so much dissatisfaction right now with Beijing's messaging on the coronavirus. Recently in Beijing, the embassy in Australia threatened to do a trade embargo on certain goods because Australia wanted an open international inquiry into the origins of the virus. And then, the faulty masks, Africans being evicted from their apartments in Guangzhou. And then just, that linked to, in the past several years, just this constant, you're hurting the feelings of the Chinese people, or if there's a criticism, it's, 你去过中国吗? Like, have you been there? Do you understand? Well, a lot of people have been there. And it's fair to raise some questions, but now I think a lot of countries are kind of at, patience level 0. So that's, really coming to a head in the last couple days, I believe.
Okay, good. David.
Yeah, and to take it kind of out to a really big strategic level, I think, Xi Jinping in his 19th Party Congress speech, it was really an extraordinary speech. And he talked quite frequently about the new option that China represented, and then used the phrase, the community of shared destiny or community of common destiny. And I don't know the Chinese, but it's a thing. And that's been a frequently used phrase since then. And it hasn't really been clearly defined, but what it looks like to the U.S., I think, is that China is interested in developing an alternative, and she actually used the term alternative in the 19th Party Congress, to the U.S. kind of model. And there's anxiety about what that exactly means for the United States, I think, going forward. And then if you were to just look at some of the activities from the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll just pick one, the Digital Silk Road. China has sold a surveillance suite that includes technology, physical infrastructure, training, and a kind of entire apparatus to conduct domestic surveillance in 18 different countries. When you combine that with the social credit score that's being rolled out in China, what that looks like to American observers is that it's a little bit reminiscent of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and laying out a different way of doing business than what we think is kind of fundamental to human rights. And so, you said earlier in the lecture, the United States is sincere about human rights. I mean, I would say it goes beyond sincerity. It is actually the foundational concept that founded the United States. And yes, there are people who have differences of opinion about them, who may be in leadership positions right now, but it is a fundamental belief of the United States. So I think, what does the community of common destiny look like? It's a little bit frightening when from what we've observed with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, good. Let's see, Emily, did you want to add something?
Sure, I agree with, I'm just looking at the list here. I agree with what David said, and also just on the point of discomfort at U.S. eroding primacy in Chinese sphere of influence. I think it's just this, we have to kind of think about first principles here, because we can think of the list of issues in terms of dissatisfaction. You could write pages and pages of it. So I think the most important part, a big issue in, I wanted to add something about the strategic distrust discussion, but we have many people had input, so I'm going to try to tie in with that, my thinking on that as well. But I think a big issue, first principles issue in US-China strategic distrust these days is kind of this lack of analysis on the underlying assumptions of threat perception. So what I mean by that is there's this kind of distance between signaling and credibility. So a China side or a US side could be signaling something, but maybe leadership is actually applying something else. And if both sides know that the signals mean nothing, then perhaps that's going to add or exacerbate at least the mistrust or distrust that's happening on the two sides. And I think if we put it into context of the US being concerned that China is reshaping the world order, as David had mentioned, like, data points, including BRI and just many other data points that show that China is becoming more involved. I think just this lack of understanding of threat perception, or perhaps actually appropriate understanding of threat perception, might actually push the two sides apart. And I don't necessarily have any constructive solutions. I think one way to make sure that the signals are interpreted as the senders mean for them to, there needs to be communication, but that just sounds like something, it sounds very nice, rosy, like kind of what I call a policy marshmallow, or like just maybe it doesn't have a lot of substance.
Huh. Okay, I'm going to jump in on the last part about need communications. One of the things that is just to suggest where I think it becomes absolutely realistic, practical, essential is when you look at deterrence theory, okay, and I've just read a little bit of it. One of the assumptions in deterrence theory, one of the premises in deterrence theory, is that the side communicating deterrence and receiving the communication of deterrence understand what the other side means. And if they don't understand what the other side means, if they misread what the other side means, if they miss the signals, then you're very quickly in a crisis mode. And, when I was in Taiwan, working at AIT, one of my senior subordinates, really smart person, came to me and said, I spent my entire career in the Middle East, and I'm finding this a little frustrating because if somebody in the Middle East disagreed with me, we'd sit down, they'd yell at me, we'd have an argument, and we'd know at least where we disagreed. And I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out these really subtle signals that the Chinese are giving me, and I just wish they'd yell at me sometimes. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is somebody who really understood signaling, in Palestine. Had real trouble with signaling in China and Taiwan. And it matters. Okay, Jenna.
The other thing I want to add to this list, and it might even honestly make my top three, the kind of 5G and control of that 5G infrastructure. But I would say mostly because of what it means for two reasons. First, from a human rights perspective, from what China will allow, kind of the norms that they'll set for 5G usage and the tech that comes with that the U.S. wouldn't allow. And also for the ways in which it's questioned our other alliances and even our kind of quote unquote special relationship with the UK that's been called into question when they said that they would be open to China's 5G infrastructure. So I think I remember at one stage in the US-China trade talks, I think Trump said that he was, he might be willing to drop some of the 5G. I don't remember the specifics, but he kind of indicated that that might not be a higher priority for him. And I think there was a lot of pushback from both parties in the foreign policy community as no, this is actually one of our top priorities, and we can't stop that.
Good. Okay. With that, I'm going to, unless there are other additions, I come now to the painful part of the slide. What is our essential ask? What is our essential dissatisfaction? What should be number one, number two, or what single point here sort of encapsulates the series of issues that are at the core of the U.S. demand? Not demand, dissatisfaction. I prefer that word at the moment. Who would like to take a crack at that? Okay, I see David and then Jesse up. So David, you got the first crack. Go.
I'll just say for the U.S., it's a question: what happens in 2045, and what is China's strategic intent as a rising power? I think that's really the source of all angst.
So you're offering this. Sort of as a new phrasing, but one that sort of encapsulates a lot of the other things that people have been raising. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just the strategic intent. I think needs to be put on the table more clearly.
Okay, excellent, Jesse.
I think the lack of reciprocity on trade is really the core issue, as we saw with the Trump administration. That was really the first fight he chose to pick with China. If Chinese companies can compete in the United States as equal to American companies, why can't ours compete in the same way in China? I think that's really part of the core issue.
Okay, and you have a topic for a paper now, if you didn't already. Okay, good point both. Mayor.
I would say it's a combination of the U.S. discomfort at our eroding primacy with the Chinese fear of influence expanding, especially combined with China's open decision-making process and lack of transparency. So kind of echoing what David was saying, that because we're unclear on what China's strategic intent is, we view them as a threat as they are rising.
Okay. And where was that one? Oh, here we go. And again, not necessarily number one, but key. And I apologize that I was slow, so I didn't get all of your additional clarifications. Okay. Anybody? Let's see. Emily?
So I would say it's also a combination of David and Jesse's proposal, but I think the more nuanced point is I would argue for it's the what happens in 2045, like what's the strategic intent. But if we are strategizing here, I think one way to at least confront China on this point would be to kind of launch a trade-related offensive, which is what the current administration is doing. But I think I want to add one more, maybe a sub-bullet to David's point, which is a lot of people kind of marry the idea of intent and capacity. And I think what we're thinking about here is it doesn't matter whether capacity is lacking right now. It's important to kind of understand where the strategic intention is and what way in the future it's going to go in terms of alternative cases. Because I think some of the arguments that are out there is, China doesn't have the capacity right now, which that should not be equated to it doesn't have the intention necessarily. And I sound like I'm playing a very, very hawkish person. I don't think I am, but.
Well, I mean, one point that I think is sort of behind your comment, and I think is an important one, is go back and read some of the comments from U.S. policymakers and U.S. analysts in the late 80s and early 90s about how China, yes, it is expressing concerns that really bother us, particularly in the wake of Tiananmen. But their capability is so lacking, we don't need to worry about it. And that was true in 1990 and 1992 and maybe even 1996. And then what happened? China is a place that has shown a capability to develop its capabilities very quickly and to a very great degree. When I went to Guangzhou whenever I went there, 88, 87, 88, the first thing I was shown was a cable that had been written by a previous consul general explaining how China's iron rice bowl mentality meant it could never develop a successful economy, and we didn't need to worry about it, and maybe we could even close our consulate in Guangzhou because it was about there's a trade fair, but nothing else worth business people paying attention to. And I often think back on that cable as how embarrassingly wrong you can be. So, good point. Mayor, did you want to come back in, or were you?
Nope, I think that was the remaining raised hand.
Okay, so anybody, are we comfortable? I'm going to move Mayor's point up here. Yep. So this is essentially where we are on this one. Is that right? This is what our essential discomfort is and the essential source of our dissatisfaction. It's almost less about issues right now than it is about where those issues seem to be going. Is that fair? Okay. Okay. I'm gonna hit save so I don't lose anything. And we had a couple of people who, in some very thoughtful ways, decided not to read the instructions and said, well, there are actually dissatisfactions that apply to both sides. And to those of you who did that, thank you. I thought that these are useful inputs. So shared dissatisfactions. The other side does not understand our point of view. The U.S. believes the PRC will only look out for its own interests, and the PRC believes the reverse of the United States. Anybody want to add anything in terms of shared dissatisfactions? Okay, I'm going to go on. We're now at 3:20, and this is about the time where we might usefully take a break. So what I'm going to propose is it's 3:21 according to the clock on my computer. Why don't we reconvene at 3:30? Okay? So see you soon. Let's see. Right. I partly concluded Where did it? Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Let's resume. I see 3:30 on my computer. So our 4 questions sort of started in 2 dimensions. Dimension number 1 was, what are the dissatisfactions on either side? Going back, the key Chinese dissatisfaction is the U.S. claim to be the leader of the global order that threatens the party and China's status and sovereignty, and selling arms to Taiwan, to the renegade Taiwan, is an example of that. But the broader framing of that is our exclusive principled claim, our containment strategy, that makes it impossible to find common ground. Human rights, trade, pandemic, ways to argue about these common challenges, which may be a good thing. U.S. dissatisfaction, the key element that we seem to put at the top was, where do all of these trends play out heading toward 2045? What is China's strategic intent as a rising power? We're looking at its trade-related offensive intent, capabilities, capacity. Don't worry about whether the capacity is now. Worry about intent. The capacity will grow. Lack of reciprocity, specifically on trade, which was Trump's first fight, but I think a broader point. And discomfort at the U.S. eroding primacy being behind this. All well-phrased, thoughtful issues. So now the question becomes, how do we deal with this? What should the U.S., what should China, let's start with China, what should China do to address U.S. concerns, U.S. dissatisfactions? And several of you suggested the first thing it should do is explain what is meant by a rising China. Take responsibility for its role in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic like a leader. Remember that the highest dignity belongs not to those who achieve power, but to those who are able to restrain themselves in order to pursue common goals. It should hold itself accountable by the international community, back down on aggressive, unproductive rhetoric in favor of constructive engagement. So those are some suggestions that I saw on the discussion board. What else would people add at this point? If the Chinese had a group going into this task force and asked for your advice, what should we do to move forward on this? What would you suggest? Anyone? Andy.
I want to suggest maybe a measure that has to do with method. I think right now we often see disagreements happening at the upper levels of leadership.
Right.
I wonder, and this is a level that we don't see as a public, but I wonder if there can be more exchange at the lower levels of junior officials, more informal exchanges, because it seems to me sometimes that the U.S. and China talk past each other. There are certain details, certain ideas, certain emotions that need to be expressed, but because the stakes are so high at the highest levels of leadership, they just don't talk about those things, and they assume the worst meanings. Now, if there can be informal exchanges at the lower levels, I think we can start to build a common vocabulary.
Uh-huh. Good. Emily.
I can add on to Andy's point, but I think I think it's a good strategy. But when you have, and I think there is a lot of at least informal contacts between junior staffs on both sides, but you have this, I think you may have mentioned in class before, the P factor, the president factor. So which at least with the U.S., like the current president of the United States, that's a huge factor right now. So I think sometimes with the presidents or the elite leaderships on the two sides having to posture either out of necessity or out of necessity, I think it's something that you can't really mitigate. So I don't know what, like, I think that's a crucial strategy, but I think it's really vulnerable to being upended. And I have a comment also on the fourth bullet point, which is hold itself accountable by the international community, which by implication is to demonstrate effective international leadership. So I absolutely agree with that. That's a good strategy. But I think in terms of backing down on aggressive and unproductive rhetoric, it really depends on the domestic politics inside of China. And like, what is the necessity on part of the party? How much do they need to play up nationalist rhetoric? Which right now, I don't think it's in a good place. They probably need to play out the nationalist rhetoric in terms of trying to restore the domestic public's trust in terms of the way it handled COVID-19. And one way for US officials to try to at least understand the situation is to make sure they have experts who understand the bureaucratic politics and larger domestic politics inside of China to even begin to, design effective policies, which is, I guess, what SAIS is for.
Well, SAIS is for that in both directions.
Right.
Okay. Nate.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of go deeper just a little bit into what Andy was talking about with the certain details with respect to, and it almost feels like it's a sub-bullet really of the previous bullet, which was constructive engagement. So, and that kind of, the whole constructive engagement theory, Chester, I forget the guy's last name, it's derived from the methodology applied to apartheid back in the 70s.
Oh boy.
But so constructive engagement and the concept of constructivism, the way Martha Finnemore describes it, if I can leverage some international relations theory, Finnemore talks about interdiscursivity, kind of like what Andy talks about.
Do that again for me. I don't know that term.
Discourse, the interaction of interdiscursivity. And then that's a term that she uses, that the more people talk with in a forum, and I think this is part of what's missing here when Andy says people talk past each other, is having that forum within which to foster interdiscursivity. So the concept that Martha Finnemore talks about in constructivism is that interdiscursivity leads to intersubjectivity, and that is a mixture of cultural identities, more so to the point of being constructive than of course the opposite. And I think it's important to mention that having that forum within the international regime, some kind of international institution in which to engage in interdiscursive dialogue about a particular
You're doing
topic,
very well at pronouncing that.
is important. And this is part of my thesis is with respect to space, is we have an opportunity here because it's a new frontier and because it's relatively unregulated, to establish forums within which to for lower level, so to speak, scientists, engineers, to engage in the international community in interdiscursive ways to help build and foster that intersubjectivity that Martha Finnemore was kind of getting at. It's a little bit of a theoretical comment, but I think it fits well within what Andy was talking about, and also your constructive engagement bullet.
Okay, good. I'm just going to sort of echoing and also sort of questioning your point, if I may. The term constructive engagement, when it is actually really done and becomes something other than a slogan, is extremely important, but it is very subject to becoming a slogan. And we have to be very careful about that. That would be my only comment there. David, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so I think if we're on the China should, I think that both sides are overdue for a a fourth communique. And my argument is that the three communiques really hit almost every single strategic issue that we've been talking about today, from trade, human rights, U.S. views on human rights, Japan militarization. That's something that we didn't bring up. Korea, something we didn't bring up. China's role in multilateral institutions, all sorts of different issues. They're all there. And what you see is that there's actually, kind of agree to disagree. Hey, these are the issues where we're going to write down in a document, and then the two sides figure out where they can agree. And I think that what we're lacking is a core document that addresses reality as it stands today, and that is China as a rising power, and actually both sides writing what they think that means to them, and then going forward with, okay, this is where we think we can actually work toward an agreement and cooperate and coexist together. And this is like not an unprecedented thing. We did the same thing with the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And I think the three communiques also, are an example of where we've done that before. And so, but I don't think that no amount of goodwill and different presidents and personalities is going to change that. And I'll just use trade as an example. The same trade issues that we are concerned about today were talked about during the George W. Bush administration, almost the exact same ones. Obama actually began enforcing them through the WTO. He took 11 actions in the WTO, I think at least 11. He had punitive tariffs. And then Bush took it into the tariff approach. But what's the difference between Bush and Obama and then Trump? And I think the difference is China's role in the world. And so I really do believe that we need to get back to a regrounding and a new framework for the relationship. Otherwise, it's just you can try to make changes along the margins. But as soon as one person replaces another person in the negotiating team, that could all change. And so I think we're overdue for a fourth communique.
Okay. Fourth communique. I have some opinions on that issue. Usually that is raised in Taiwan regarding U.S.-China differences over Taiwan, where my personal opinion is it gets you in more trouble than it resolves. But I think the way in which you're describing it is almost an outgrowth of a book that I asked you to read, Debating China. It's sort of bringing that to a level of strategic direction, which would be enormously difficult to do, but I think would be a very constructive effort. And then the question would become how you would do that, which would be awfully, awfully tough. Other thoughts? Mark.
Sure. Just really fascinating discussion. Just to kind of go to the top about how China should engage with the international community. I really think it's in an unenviable bind. Part of it probably with response to COVID for good reason. It could probably buy a lot of the world's trust with acting in ways that we would consider reciprocal to global responsibility, to UN, to World Health Organization, and even to a lot of European powers that are already at loggerheads with the U.S. But it also will invite itself open to all sorts of criticism, huge criticism in the U.S. Congress and news media, and in other countries that in the global swing states that they're trying to win over today. I did some reading on, and I just think that they are probably watching this very closely, and they are trying to calibrate a response that will win the goodwill of the globe, but not invite unnecessary criticism that will become its own political issue for them that will be bigger to challenge.
Okay, good. Jesse? And then Alex. And then, Alex, you raised your hand twice. Anyway, Jesse.
China should join the United States in applying maximum pressure on the North Korean Kim regime as a way to build strategic trust.
Okay. Interesting. So you're suggesting this really as a test case, a way in which the two sides could do something together that would be in their shared interests and that would then build the trust that could go on to other issues. Is that it?
I think it's realistic. I think it's a short term. Short term, I think it's achievable. So let's give it a try.
Would the U.S. be willing in response to say that U.S. ground forces will not go north of the DMZ? Should they?
I think they should be open to considering that commitment.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Alex.
Just try to, I'm not like, I'm thinking maybe China should try to kind of cultivate the global citizenship of its citizens. Like, it's similar to the above discussions, but more focused on its citizens. That for what I saw, it seems that such as in the outbreak of COVID-19, the local officials did not really think firsthand the seriousness of the disease, but to think about like how did there be punished or so. I think, and there's some other things that makes me feel like China is making itself isolated, and that's why. Yeah.
Okay, good. Another reminder of why it's important to have U.S. students in China and Chinese students in the United States, but this is more at a governmental level. And, it's an interesting challenge for Chinese local officials, also for U.S. local officials, although I think in some cases trade and investment helps with that. Anyway, Ashley.
Actually, just kind of thinking of just your comment on the North Korean issue. I actually think it's kind of hard for them. I mean, U.S. and China do have shared interest in terms of a peaceful a peaceful Korean peninsula. However, I do feel they, like, because of the current strategic distrust, they'll have very different goals for how the peninsula looks like in the near future. And currently, I think China has greater shared interest with South Korea and Japan rather than with the US in terms of the nuclear negotiations. So I think it's more likely that China would seek to cooperate with with South Korea instead of with the US. However, I do feel North Korea is definitely some an issue that might actually undermine the strategic distrust, mainly because if the North Korea becomes peaceful, then China would be less worried about U.S. military deployment in the region. So in the other way, they would like kind of mitigate the distrust. But I don't think there's a very huge chance of China directly cooperating with the U.S. But yeah, I mean, like,
don't go anywhere. Hold on to that.
The only thing I would say on that is I think all the stakeholders would consider it less bad if there was greater Chinese influence in the north in exchange for no nukes in the hands of the Kim regime. I think South Korea would feel more secure. The U.S. could feel more secure. So it's a less bad scenario.
Let me ask a question to both of you and anyone else who wants to chime in. Let us say that Beijing decides they really can't cooperate with Washington on the DPRK, the nuclear issue, the erratic behavior of the Kim Jong-un regime. But they can cooperate with Tokyo and Seoul. And if Tokyo and Seoul came to us, came to Washington, came to the director of the NSC, National Security Advisor, president, and said, you know, guys, Beijing is really not willing to work with you on North Korea, but they are willing to work with us. What do you think? Should the U.S. say unacceptable, or should the U.S. say go for it and, let us know what we can do to help? Oscar, is this on this question?
Yes, sir. Just directly to what you just asked. My opinion is that the U.S. should absolutely accept that, and I also feel that the U.S. would accept that. The promotion of bilateral diplomacy between the Moon government in South Korea and the Kim regime by the Trump administration, to me, signals that it's all for anyone taking on this problem productively and getting it solved within the red lines that we have, which I imagine are very similar to the red lines that Japan and South Korea have as well. So those two countries can be trusted to hold the line. I think that we would and should be all for them working with Beijing on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's my instinct. And, as some of you, I'm sure all of you are aware to one extent or another, Seoul and Tokyo have had major differences over the past several years. And if Beijing could somehow work it out that the three of them resolve the North Korea issue or work towards solving it in a way that's brought Seoul and Tokyo closer together, I quite frankly think we would very quietly close the door of our offices, pull out a beer, and smile and lean back. I mean, that would certainly be my reaction. But anyway, let me just at this point go to, we have all of these great ideas. What is the key issue? What is the key step China should take? What's the key way forward? What do we do above all? What did they do? We do above all else. Anybody? I don't think this is an easy question, but I welcome any comments. Where do we start this one? Oscar?
This might sound like I'm trying to sound funny, but I'm not. Fundamentally change the entire calculus of your regime stability and your social contract, all of your regional interests. I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm trying to make the point that this question is extremely difficult when it comes to what do you do, what do we do, because the basic state stability interests and regional security interests are very much diametrically opposed, in my opinion. Okay. There might be some micro areas. I mean, the North Korea suggestion, sir, that would be an extremely productive one. However, there's also a strong case to be made that the status of the Kim regime, as long as they don't do anything too crazy that provokes a regional war, it does help in those peripheral security interests. So it's very difficult to say, this is the magic bullet or this is the first constructive step that absolutely can be taken and produce results.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Lambiao, you wanted to add something?
Sir, I think from the economic side, China should continue reforming on the state-owned enterprise and continue opening up the market in a very meaningful way, because of the coronavirus is hitting the Chinese economy very hard, both from the demand side, and China has a very unhealthy GDP, which is composed of majorly real estates, and most of the capital is congregated in the SOE and the top elites, rather than in the middle class. So I think China should really seriously think about opening up the market and engaging in very realistic economic reform.
Okay. So you're coming back to that argument that we saw last week in The State Strikes Back. You're saying this would be in U.S. interest, would be seen as being in U.S. interest, but would also be in China's own self-interest.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got Jesse and then I've got Jeremy. Jesse.
To refer to the first bullet point on this slide, from the public affairs dimension, China can consider fine-tuning their messaging in terms like what is a rising China, so that the U.S. public won't interpret those phrases in with sinister kind of schemes or ambitions.
Yes, and remember that rising China was a phrase that was first introduced, I want to say, in 2010. Do I have that date right? And then withdrawn because the Hu Jintao regime thought it would be unsettling to other powers. So messaging there's a good argument to be made for that, particularly given where we ended up on U.S. dissatisfactions. Jeremy.
I just want to say about the first bullet point of this slide, which is the rising China. So what does that even mean? Like, if the US and China try to make a progress cooperation in the future, I think both countries need to make some kind of compromise. But what if the rising China means that China try to overturn the international order set by the US after World War II, which is clearly not in interest of the United States? Then if both sides refuse to make any compromise in their intentions, I don't feel like there's too much to negotiate, too much to discuss about the current situation. For example, like for North Korea, I think there is some middle ground the US and China can seek, which is the non-nuclear DPRK exists in the Korean Peninsula, but also like solving. But what if China want to use the DPRK as a pawn against the United States in the East Asia? Try to not the US get what they want, which is the very peaceful Korean Peninsula. I think at that point, it's just not much things that both sides can discuss about this issue. So it is very important for the US and China to see how to make the compromise for a little bit interest of each other and try to seek a way in the middle ground to make a constructive cooperation in the future. So that's just my little bit thought on this.
Okay, I'm going to take last comment from Edward, and then I'm going to suggest where I hear people coming out.
Yeah, just a very quick point on the, of course.
I lost.
A very quick argument on the first bullet point. Explain what rising China means. I think back to 2002, a very famous Chinese scholar who is Zheng Bijian has mentioned.
That's what it was. Yes.
Yeah, term which is China is peaceful rising, which means and it was adopted by Hu Jintao administration.
Right.
But I think but it also raises a lot of concerns of the outside world, not because of the peaceful, just because of the rise. So I think the point I want to bring here is that China has to find a way to let the outside world, especially the Western world, to correctly interpret its intentions. So how you express your intention, does not matter, but how could you make the others correctly understand your intention does matter. And I think it's extremely difficult when the strategic distrust is so serious today.
Okay, good. I'm going to suggest, in a sense, several of you have made this issue in one way or another where you think the focus should be. And I think that makes a lot of sense. My only one comment I would make is it needs to go beyond rhetoric. Explain what rising China means and take steps to demonstrate that meaning. Now, does that mean a constructive stakeholder? Does it mean redefining what the stakes are? Are there constructive middle grounds on doing that? And I think the idea of test case being in the DPRK. And I'll just move Jesse's point up to number 2 and see if I get away with it. Yep. That might be, one constructive way in which to do it. I'm not saying that they should assume all the responsibility for the misunderstanding, but, what is that old line that talk is cheap? So, okay, I'm going to stop here or we're going to be horribly behind schedule. We got relatively fewer comments on what the United States should do. And I thought they were an interesting mixture of toughen its own position and be more cooperative. So here we have the U.S. should maintain its hard power and its allies. At the same time, it should be more prudent in international affairs. It should adopt the Cold War approach of ceding spheres of influence to our competitors. And it should allow spheres of influence in the Pacific as a possible way to ease tensions. Which sounds to me a little bit like the Mearsheimer approach. And Nate Daly says, whatever Graham Allison says, not that. Okay, I will take that, Nate, as your first comment on this. Okay. What should the United States do? Are there other things we should do, or is there something in here that you would prioritize? What should we do? What should the United States do, whether it is we or they? How do they fix this one? Let's start with those 3 letters that we saw from Ambassador Stapleton Roy, John Pomfret, and then the group of military officers. The military officers' letter was entitled "Stay the Course." Is that the right answer?
No, this is Emily.
Okay.
I would offer up, I feel like I've been abusing this term in all my papers this semester, but I talk about this intelligent competition, which means not outright competition in all spheres, just identifying, which is what we've been doing kind of this entire class, is identifying common areas that could be worked on. But also being, this is speaking from the US side, being resolute in areas that are non-negotiable. But I understand that policy isn't something that you can just necessarily compartmentalize. It's not like we can be happy-go-lucky in certain areas, but then also just not talk to each other in others. So that's the conundrum, I think, in terms of intelligently competing.
Okay, good point. I just want to pick up, if I may, Emily, on your point about, some areas are non-negotiable, some we may need to remain resolute on. But, the more areas of interaction that we bring into the discussion, the more flexibility we have in reaching reasonable compromises, reasonable trade-offs among all of our interests. So I'm all in favor of keeping as many issues on the table as possible. I'm also all in favor of keeping as many players in the game as possible for the same reason. To the extent that this becomes a multilateral discussion rather than a bilateral discussion, I would argue all interests are served. Jesse, you had something to say.
The U.S. should lead by example in all issue areas. If they think China's response to COVID was non-transparent or inadequate, then the U.S. should have a better response for other countries to model off of. If the U.S. has issues with human rights in China, then the U.S. should lead by example in solving some inequalities in the United States, or on climate, another issue. If there's issues with Chinese pollution, then rejoin Paris. So I think the top line message is to lead by example. If the United States is confident that its system has advantages over the Chinese system, then to shore it up and to stay the course on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ashley.
I think so. I've read this idea somewhere else, but I really agree to it that the U.S. should decide what exactly it wants the world order to be, given the fact that China is rising materially, and because the U.S. might say they want to contain China, but the fact is China's growth is it is naturally going to be like that for the near future, just because of the size of its economy and the size of its population. And given that, I think the US lacks a general strategy about how they want to place China in the international order. They don't want to give up their supremacy of the American power, but then how are they going to place a rising China in the international order? Containing China is a response, but not a goal or like a vision of the future international order. So I think that is very important.
Interesting. Good. Emily?
Sorry, I just wanted to add on to my old point. Maybe it could be a sub bullet under, but I was trying to think back on whether just US policy was there consistency in terms of the items that are considered non-negotiable. And I think just the gross abuse of human rights is a non-negotiable item. However, it's been kind of woefully ignored, kind of put on a back burner in the past few administrations. And one turning point in history that I can think of is I think it was President Clinton's first administration in terms of China every year had to get trade access approval from the United States. And it was supposed to have the human rights condition or provision, but then that had to be essentially ditched after. That was one of the turning points that kind of showed, at least signaled to the Chinese side that, oh, I guess human rights isn't that non-negotiable to you guys, huh? And I think that's something that the current administration is definitely doing, at least in terms of signaling, it's doing a good job, because there have been legislatures that are related to Xinjiang, related to Tibet, but I don't know in terms of implementation how that's going to play out. But I think it is kind of a minor turning point. It all depends. But this goes back to kind of the first principle issue again about signaling credibility.
Okay, good. Let's see, Edward.
I have something to add on the Ashley's point. I think the United States should realize that the interactions, the economic interactions between U.S. and China will surely lead China to develop overall. I mean, in other aspects like military or geopolitical, and it's impossible for China to just develop economically while just stand still on other sides. And I think this kind of development will not necessarily lead to the democratization or liberalization in China, at least in the short term. I think the Americans should. I know it's not comfortable for the United States, but I think the United States should get along with it, at least in the near future. And I think the United States should be comfortable with should get used to the relative reduction on its power. As like Hans Morgenthau has said, a nation that at a particular moment in history finds itself at the peak of its power is particularly exposed to the temptation to forget that all power is relative. I think it's not because the US is going down, just because of the China is going up and the power is relative. So United States should be used to kind of the rebalance of the world.
Okay. I just want to pick up on your, I think those are all good points. I'm going to pick up on your last one. One of the things that struck me that the U.S. got right after World War II, after having watched it go horribly wrong after World War I, and that is we went and helped rebuild the economies of our enemies. We rebuilt the economies of Germany, at least Western Germany, as it turned out, and Japan. We rebuilt the economy, or helped the United Kingdom, Great Britain, rebuild its economy. And that, by simple relative calculation, reduced the overall scale of our power on the world stage. I would argue we are, as you suggest, one of the reasons why China has greater power now than it did in 1978, 79. And I think that is something that we should take some credit for. But anyway, okay, next up I see Oscar, then Travis, then I'm going to wrap this one up. Oscar.
Yeah, my point's a very minor one. It goes off of what Emily was saying about the human rights criticisms and what the Trump administration is doing. This is more of a what the U.S. should not do. I think that unless we're prepared to go all in on a certain issue, some of the things that we do, like targeted sanctions against a distant Communist Party official that no one in the Western Hemisphere has heard of, or some random company that, again, very few people on this side of the world has heard of. It's a good symbolic measure, or at least it plays that way over here. But I think things like that don't do much to advance the human rights concern, but they do a lot to galvanize the sense of, America's meddling in internal Chinese affairs. The CCP is fighting back against these things. And, there's a way to craft that narrative legitimately. So I think that those very targeted micro measures might be more counterproductive in the long run.
Okay, excellent point. Travis, you have at least, as in this exchange, the last word. Go.
So I wanted to push back on the containment not as a vision. I think containment can very much be a vision of how you plan on interacting with the international world. We just need to look at NSC 68 and the way the U.S. handled the Soviets, and the plans that they used there for that, to say that, and I'm not arguing that containment is the right answer for this particular set of problems, but I will argue that containment has been used in the past, and potentially how you look at it could have been used, or was used successfully against the Soviets.
Okay. But you're not arguing that it could be, are you arguing that it could be used successfully, or that lessons could be taken from it for interacting with China?
I am. So I'm not arguing that containment is solely the only answer, because it's a different world now than it was then. But I am arguing that lessons can be taken from containment. Like, I wouldn't argue that we have NSC 68 version 2, but I would argue that lessons can be taken in order to use pieces and parts of containment again against China.
Can you give me an example?
On like parts of containment that we could use?
Yeah.
I mean, you could do things that would diminish the economic impact of China in the Pacific region. One of the things that I'm working on right now and researching is, does COVID allow the United States an opportunity to muscle back into Africa and begin to contain China's influence on that continent vis-a-vis the Belt and Road Initiative, and maybe the U.S. can reassert itself on that continent in order to put China, a step back.
Okay, good. Oscar, I will violate my rule, and I will give you a 2-finger on this one if you want one.
Oh, no, sorry, sir. That was a residual hand.
That was a residual hand. Okay. So we have a whole range of options here for what the U.S. should do. Some of them are lessons from the Cold War or approaches from the Cold War. Emily's of intelligent competition or leading by example. I'm sort of taken by Ashley's comment about the U.S. needs to decide what it wants the world order to be, which seems to me to be an interesting strategic first step. So what would be the first step that someone would recommend on this? Anybody? Where do we start?
Sorry, do you mean the first step of the US, like what US should try to do, or like the kind of vision they should have?
No, I'm just thinking about what the first step is. Should we start with the vision thing? Is that really where we need to begin? Or should we, if we're going into these discussions, we're saying China, you have these dissatisfactions. The US decides we should do this. Anybody?
I'll just kickstart because I started all this. I think it's very important for the US to recognize the things have been changing, and I've written somewhere else that it's more likely. So personally, I think China is more likely to pursue at least in the near future, to pursue a multipolar kind of system rather than a unipolar one. However, I think the US has to reevaluate how the US system is changing, not only because of the rise of China, but also because of the things happening in Europe. So reevaluation would be the first step. I see someone in the comments. I think reevaluation is the first step to start.
Okay.
And also, I think the US should reconsider working with China on economic affairs in a cooperative way, because I do feel like strategic distrust is something that you either solve it early or it will deteriorate to a point that you cannot solve it anymore. Like economic affairs would be helpful for you to undermine strategic distrust when it's still in time. But when the strategic distrust moves to a certain level, then neither side would agree to work in a cooperative way anymore. And we're seeing this tendency now. So I think that's very dangerous.
Okay. I'm willing to take that as a first step. Ashley, you're going to have to respond to some people on the group chat, but I'll leave that to you.
Yes.
Okay. Does that make sense to people as a first step? Okay. I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to step on to the next sort of phase in this. Both sides should. I think these are all good comments. Getting past our mutual stalemate is certainly an interesting one. And given the time constraints, I'm just going to make a few observations here under obstacles in process. And after I make my comments, I'll open it up for a minute. One of the questions in all of these things is, how do you do it? Obviously there are some things that are going to take very long-term resolution, strategic distrust being part of it, although we can make concrete steps in the short term. But I just want to throw out a couple of things that strike me as immediate procedural process type of issues that are important. If you were going to do this, where would you do it? Do you do track 2 or track 1? Or 1.5? Is it an official dialogue or an unofficial one? How does it move? What level do you start at? There was some discussion among a few of you about, do we start at the junior level, but with, what did you call it, the P problem? Or, how do you ensure that these lower level discussants are accepted as having authority to represent the concerns of their side? And I think that's true in both cases. And how then would you move the discussion from the initial discussion into implementation? All of these would have to be very carefully thought out. Is it a secret dialogue or a public dialogue? At what point do you move from one to the other? That has a major impact on your flexibility. But at a certain point, you have to move beyond the flexibility that a secret process gives you to building a base of support, a base of consensus on both sides, and that requires a public process. So with that, I want to claim it's usually called the privilege of the chair, but I'm going to say the privilege of the prof, and give some closing thoughts about what I take out of all that we've done over the past 13 weeks. We've tried to understand the bilateral relationship, but not as Holy Writ. It's not the relationship, which I tend to hear in some US government circles. It's an instrument, as I've said a couple of times, used by either side to advance its interests. It's the result of histories and interests that each side brings in pursuit of its interests. The interaction of these efforts, both domestic and international, political and economic. It is not the exclusive province of government officials, diplomats, or military officers. Business people, economic interests, financial interests, NGO interests, okay? Academics, all of that have a major impact on this, sometimes more than do the diplomats, okay? And I'm going to go from there to Professor Lampton's preface that I asked you to look at to his book, Following the Leader, Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. His 2018 preface says that after the reform era, there were 4 possibilities: political regression, transformational leadership, incremental reform, or the center does not hold. In other words, fragmentation of authority. He then argues that Deng's reform project led to 3 things: less dominant, more transactional leaders, urbanism and pluralism in Chinese society, and stronger authority by societal elements at the expense of government. And he then says, these 3 massive internal changes worried Xi and his allies. And I think that's absolutely right. And then finally, he says that China is using the pretext of an external threat to persuade Chinese to, quote, subordinate themselves to the need for overall social solidarity in the face of the threat. That leads him to his wrap-up, which you may agree with or not, but here it is. In the current era of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, both nations are following their leaders down dangerous roads. Both of them have made some important decisions, can argue some constructive decisions, but Professor Lampton's assessment is the road that both sides are on is dangerous. Okay, with that, this is how I think we address these challenges. Number 1 is both sides need to understand. There needs to be a group of people on either side in interaction with the other side that have a deep knowledge that leads to an almost instinctive sense of what the other is about. If you know someone, an individual, really well, and somebody comes up to you and says, would so-and-so like this as a birthday present? And you go, oh. And they say, what's wrong? And you say, I don't know what's wrong. It just doesn't feel like that. Okay? We have to have that at a certain point, that instinctive sense. And that requires people with a deep learning and commitment to learning about the other. And that's what I think one of the things that you and your fellow students at SLICE are doing. I would argue China's primary goal does not regard the United States. It is stability, prosperity, and pride. And that includes international respect. It leads to concern about displacing the United States, but that effort is derivative from its primary national goals. The U.S. primary national goal is security. stability, security, prosperity, and respect for its leadership role over the past 100 years in establishing a stable and incrementally more just international order. There is overlap in these goals. Not complete overlap, but there is some, and we need to build on that. We need to prioritize. And I would argue a revived global prosperity is where we start. And a increasing sense of a security status quo. And, you know, China requires domestic stability. We require it. When I refer to a security status quo, the U.S. needs to find a cooperative place for China as a major strategic power and a major military security force. At the same time, China needs to back off aggressive hegemonism, especially in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Bob Sutter at George Washington University has written a book. Some of you may have read, Chinese Foreign Relations. And one of the points he makes in that is that China's aggressive confrontational posture in Southeast Asia has actually increased the degree of U.S. support there. That's certainly not in China's interest. And then we need to take the longer term. What is not immediately possible has to be placed not as something not to be done, but accept that it is less urgent. China needs to accept that it is being given respect. We need to show respect without conceding on values. I'm just going to give you a small example. China needs to allow the United States to open American centers in cities across China. They have worked systematically to close them. We need to find a way for Confucius centers, just like Alliance Francaise or the Goethe centers of Germany, to open in the United States in ways that both sides increase cultural dialogue without creating reasons for confrontation. Strategic distrust has grown up over 200 years. It will not disappear in a decade. It's a long-term effort. And that leads me to Robert Blackwell's very interesting proposal for 22 prescriptions. And I'm going to suggest very briefly that we flip that. He talks about allowing for off-ramps to avoid confrontation. And that suggests to me, in a metaphor, that we're having off-ramps because the main highway we're on is toward confrontation, and we need to allow off-ramps. I think we need to prepare for the worst, as Blackwell does, but we should be building a highway that leads away from confrontation towards shared interests in concert with global partners. And that there are, rather than off-ramps, that there are what I call guardrails, clear deterrent factors on both sides. We need to start with shared interests. We need to build those shared interests. And I think we've had a good discussion about some ways in which to do that. So we need to do all of that. It's not an easy challenge, but it is a challenge that I think this class has discussed in some thoughtful ways. So here's my conclusion. We should not be naive on either side, China or the United States. Finding a viable path forward on our relations in our separate interests will be damn difficult. We should be realists, and I think Blackwell is a realist. But we can be liberal internationalists at the same time. We can look to build ties that benefit all and provide guardrails to avoid confrontation and to deter either side from confrontation. And so I'm going to close with a line from Chinese history. And it's a line that I'm going to rewrite the history. Mao Zedong, on his deathbed, spoke to Hua Guofeng. And he said, well, wait a minute. No, he didn't speak to Hua Guofeng. He actually said this to Deng Xiaoping. Everybody's gotten the history wrong. It wasn't Hua Guofeng. And he said, with you in charge, I am at ease. And so I see you folks not as Hua Guofengs, but as leaders of the next generation. And with you in charge, or soon to be in charge, I am at ease. And so I just want to conclude there. I want to thank you all for the past 13 weeks and all that you have shared and done. Congratulate you. I hope that I will be able to do that in person and raise a glass of red wine, whereas now I simply raise my coffee cup. And congratulate you for what you have done and what you are about to do. Thank you. If there's anything I can do to help you on the way forward, please let me know. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, because I'm a professor, because I'm concerned about deadlines and stuff, just a reminder, okay? Papers due on May 1st. Final exam is May 11th. If you have any questions about that along the way, shoot me an email either on my Johns Hopkins account or on my Gmail account. And with that, thank you. Any questions or comments or?
Just a question for the final exam. Will it be due on the day off, or will we have like a day or two to write it?
I would ask you to take about 3 hours to do it.
Okay.
It will be released in the morning. It will be due by COB that evening. Same interpretation of COB that I have offered in previous accounts. I don't want you to spend several days doing this.
And will it be like short essays? Is that the key?
Okay, good question. It will be, I anticipate at the moment, it will be 3 essays of which you will be asked to write on 2. In 3 topics, you'll be asked to write on 2.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions?
Professor, how do you recommend that we best study for the final exam? Would you recommend reviewing the readings, lecture notes?
We all think differently. What I would suggest as one way to do it is to look